In this video from ITFreeTraining, I will look at the basics of how Windows security works. Understanding how security works in Windows will help you understand how to secure your network, as well as provide the building blocks for troubleshooting your network. In order to do this, I will look at the security principle, security identifier, access control entry, access control list, and lastly, access tokens. All these work together to either allow or deny access. In later videos, I will look at how permissions work, but this video will provide you the foundation for those videos. A security principal is an entity that can be authenticated. If you think about it, when asking for access to anything, the first question that is asked is, who is asking for access? The security principal is just that. Who is asking for access? To give some examples of security principles, a security principal can be a user or a computer. These are the most common ones, but also a process running on the computer is considered a security principal. If you consider an example of this, say you have a service running on the computer, and that process requires access to files on the computer. The operating system needs to know who is asking for access to those files. So the process needs to have a security principle applied to it. You will find that any object or entity in Windows has a security principle. For example, an object in Active Directory will have a security principle. This allows the operating system to determine who is asking for something or who it is being applied to. So the security principle is kind of like giving something a name. But this brings up the next question. What happens when two entities have the same name? This brings us to the next topic of security identifiers, or SIDs. A SID, put simply, is a unique number. It is used to identify an object or entity in Windows, just like a serial number could be used to identify any household appliance. Whenever an object or entity is created in Windows, a unique SID is created, so essentially, every security principle has a unique SID. Windows now has a system to uniquely identify objects even if they have the same name. Shown here are some examples of SIDs. If you want to learn more about the format of a SID, I have included a link in the references part of this video which describes the format of the SID in more detail. Essentially, all SIDs start with S. The shorter SIDs are non-domain SIDs, so are used only locally on the computer. The longer SIDs are domain SIDs, which include the authority, domain, and a unique number. Since the SID is essentially a long unique number, it is generally not that important to understand the format of them, but more so how they are used. To show a real example of a SID, I will open regedit and navigate down through regedit until I reach the container profile list. Any user that logs into a Windows system will have a profile for that user automatically created and listed here. The containers listed here are named after the SID of that user. You can see the first three containers have short SIDs. These are profiles belonging to local users. Below this is a profile belonging to a domain user. You can see that the profile image path key that this profile belongs to is a user account called trainer. The container below this, you can see, belongs to the domain administrator account. This is just one example of how SIDs are used in Windows. To better understand how SIDs work, I will look at another example. Let's consider a user called John Doe, who worked for the company. When the user was created, the user was given a unique SID. John Doe later left the company, and the user account was deleted. Later on, a new user, also called John Doe, started working for the company. When this user was created, a new unique SID was created. You can see that even though the two users have the same name, Windows can tell them apart because the SIDs are different. If a third user was created in a different domain with, once again, the name John Doe, this user will have a unique SID created and assigned to that user. You can see how three different users can be uniquely identified. This essentially means that if you create a new user with the same name, that user will always get a new SID. It is important to understand this fact when deleting a user. When you delete a user, the SID associated with that user is also deleted. As we will see in a moment, this SID may have been used in groups and assigned to files, folders, or objects. Once the user is deleted, this association is lost. If you are not 100% sure that you will never need that user again, nor the access granted to that user, it is recommended to disable the user rather than deleting it. Disabling the user prevents it from being used, but keeps any access that user had been configured with. If you do decide that you need that user again, all you need to do is enable the user. It is common practice to disable a user when they leave a company. When a person is hired to replace that person, it is just a matter of renaming that user to the name of the new user. Since the SID associated with the user still exists, the new staff member will have all the same access as the previous staff member. So now that we understand how security principles and SIDs work, how do these get used to determine what a user has access to? In order to determine if a security principle is allowed access, an ACE and ACL are used. These are access control entry and access control list. To understand how these work, consider this example. The user, John Doe, wants to access a file in a Word document. In order for this to occur, Windows needs to determine if John Doe is allowed access to the file. To do this, an ACE, or access control entry, is created with the SID of John Doe in it. This ACE is what grants John Doe access to the file. So, what is an ACL? An ACL is a list of ACEs, or, to put it another way, a list of everyone who is allowed access to a file. In this case, the access list only contains one entry, but more entries could be added. For example, the domain users group, system users, and admin users could be added. You can see how the access control list controls who has access to the file. When an access request is received, the SID from that request is looked at to see if there is a match in the access list. The next question that arises is it possible for an attacker to get the SID of a user and use that SID to gain access to a file that they do not have permission to access? To answer this question, this brings us to the next part of the Windows security process. To prevent unauthorized access, Windows uses an access token. The access token contains the security context of that entity. The security context is essentially the SID, permissions, group membership, and anything that particular entity has access to. That sounds complicated, so let's look at an example. Consider once again you have the user John Doe. Before John Doe can access any resources on the network, first John Doe needs to be authenticated by a domain controller. In order for this to occur, John Doe enters in his password, which the domain controller checks to ensure that it is correct. Once this occurs, the domain controller generates an access token for that user. In this access token goes information like the user's SID and the SIDs of any groups that user is a member of. This is then transferred to the user. Now that the user has an access token, they can use that access token to access resources on the network. Let's consider a server on the network with a file share. The file share has permissions assigned to it, which forms an access control list, or ACL. When the user attempts to access the file share, their token is transferred to the server. Once the server has the token, it compares the SIDs in the token with the SIDs in the access list assigned to the share. If it finds a match, the user is granted access. If no match is found, the user is denied access. When an access token is presented to the server is able to quickly check that the access token is valid. Access tokens use technology like digital signatures to ensure that a token has not been modified. It is not a simple matter for an attacker to create their own access tokens, since they do not have the keys that the domain controller used to sign the access token when it was created. Also notice that since the access token was created during authentication, if the user is added or removed from any groups, the access token would need to be recreated. This essentially means that when changes are made that affect the access token, the user must log off and log back on again for a new access token to be created. This covers the fundamental concepts of Windows security, but before finishing this video, let's have a look at how this works in a real operating system. If I now open Windows Explorer and then open the properties for a folder on the C drive and select the Security tab, this will show the Security Access Control list for this folder. I have disconnected this computer from the network, so it is not able to access the domain controller. You will notice that the first two entries, Authenticated Users and System, are present. These are what are referred to as special identities. They are special local users that are the same on every install of Windows. I will cover special identities in more detail in a later video. Since the local Windows install knows the identity of these users, so to speak, it is able to display the name. If I scroll down and then freeze the video, notice that the last two entries are the SID rather than a friendly name. Since the SID is short, we know this SID is local rather than domain-based. In this brief second where the video has been frozen, the operating system has not had a chance to get any information about the two SIDs. If I now unfreeze the video, notice the top entries are still showing their SIDs. However, the bottom two entries have now been resolved. These are the local group administrators and the local group users. If I now plug the computer back into the network, the computer will once again be able to access the domain controller to obtain this information. If I close this window and then reopen it again, notice the SIDs have changed to Trainer and Domain Users. You should be able to see now that when it comes to security, the only thing that is stored in the access control list is the SID and not the name. This is why you can rename a user or group at any time without affecting the security that user or group has been used on. There has been a lot covered in this video, so let's perform a quick summary. A security principal is an entity that can be authenticated. This is essentially a user, group, or process. When a security principal is created, for example, a user is created, a unique SID is created with it. Since this unique SID is used to identify the security principal can be renamed at any time. It should also be remembered that when the entity is deleted, the SID is lost. For this reason, consider disabling rather than deleting. Companies will often disable a user when that person leaves the company and rename and enable the user account when a replacement is found. A security identifier, or SID, is essentially a unique number. A SID is used in access control entries. For example, if you want to give access to someone, an access control entry would need to be created to give them access. These access control entries are put into access control lists. An access token is created when authentication occurs, which is generally when a user first logs in. The access token defines what the user can access and is used to grant access to other systems. The access token is mathematically time-consuming to create and requires secret keys to be created and stored on domain controllers. For this reason, it is not easy to fake an access token. However, it is easy to check that the access token is legitimate. Since the access token contains information about what can be accessed, when changes are made, like group membership, the access token must be recreated. In the case of users, this means that they need to log off and log back on again. This concludes this video. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you in other videos from us. Till next time, thanks for watching.